Picture this: a quiet girl sitting alone at lunch, counting crumpled dollar bills with trembling fingers, completely unaware that 3 bullies are circling her table like vultures. What happens next will shock you, because sometimes the mouse you're trying to corner turns out to be a lion in disguise. This is the story of Emma Martinez, and trust me, you've never seen revenge served this cold. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Emma Martinez clutched her worn backpack straps as she navigated the crowded hallways of Lincoln Middle School, her eyes fixed firmly on the scuffed linoleum beneath her feet. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows that seemed to follow her every step. She'd been at Lincoln for exactly 3 weeks now, and each day felt like walking through a minefield where any wrong move could trigger an explosion of unwanted attention. The move from Sacramento had been sudden, unexpected, and entirely unwelcome. Her father, Mr. Rodriguez, had gotten a job transfer to this small suburban town called Riverside, promising Emma that a fresh start would be good for both of them. What he hadn't mentioned was how suffocating small towns could be, where everyone knew everyone else's business and newcomers stuck out like neon signs in a library. The whispers followed her everywhere. She caught fragments of conversations as students huddled near their lockers, their voices dropping to conspiratorial tones whenever she passed. "That's the new girl," they'd say, "the one who never talks to anyone." Some were merely curious, wondering why someone would choose to eat lunch alone every day, or why she always wore long sleeves even when the weather was warm. Others were less kind, speculating about her past and inventing stories to fill the gaps her silence left behind. Emma had learned long ago that silence was safer than explanation, that invisibility was preferable to scrutiny. The truth was, Emma carried secrets that would have given those gossip-hungry classmates more material than they could handle in a lifetime. 3 years ago, she'd been California's junior gymnastics champion in her age group, destined for elite competition and possibly the Olympics. Her life had revolved around training schedules, protein shakes, and the satisfying thud of her feet hitting the mat after a perfect dismount. Coach Williams had called her a natural, praising her ability to channel fear into focus, to transform nervous energy into explosive power. But that was before the accident, before the injury that ended her competitive career, and before the incident that made staying in Sacramento impossible. Now, as she pushed through the cafeteria doors, Emma's trained eye automatically scanned for potential threats. It was a habit she'd developed, this constant assessment of her surroundings, looking for exits, measuring distances, calculating risks. The cafeteria at Lincoln Middle School was typical of its kind. Rows of long tables surrounded by plastic chairs, the air thick with the mingled aromas of pizza, chocolate milk, and teenage anxiety. Students clustered in their established social groups, the invisible boundaries between cliques as rigid as prison walls. Emma made her way to her usual spot, a small table near the emergency exit that most students avoided because of its proximity to the garbage cans. She preferred it precisely because it was undesirable to others. It meant she could eat in peace while keeping an eye on everyone around her. As she unpacked her homemade lunch, carefully arranged by her father that morning, she noticed Ben Thompson being cornered near the vending machines by Derek Kane and his crew. Ben was everything Emma recognized in herself: small, quiet, and desperately trying to remain invisible. He was the kind of kid who did his homework during lunch, who raised his hand in class only when directly called upon, and who flinched whenever someone raised their voice. His thick glasses were held together with tape. His clothes were always slightly too big, and he carried himself with the perpetual hunch of someone expecting the next blow. Derek Kane, on the other hand, was everything Ben wasn't. Tall for his age, confident to the point of arrogance, and blessed with the kind of natural charisma that made adults trust him and peers follow him. As student body president, Derek had perfected the art of being a model student in front of teachers while terrorizing his classmates when authority figures weren't looking. Emma watched as Derek's friends, Madison Foster and Troy Hansen, flanked Ben against the vending machines. Madison was the kind of girl who weaponized her popularity, using social dynamics like a chess master moving pieces across a board. She'd perfected the art of the backhanded compliment, the exclusionary invitation, and the strategic rumor. Troy was simpler in his cruelty, preferring direct intimidation to psychological warfare. Together, they formed a triangle of misery that had made Lincoln Middle School their personal playground. "Come on, Ben," Derek's voice carried across the cafeteria, though he kept it low enough that the lunch monitors wouldn't notice. "We know your sister makes good money at that restaurant. Surely you can spare a few dollars for the student activity fund." The way he said it made it sound almost reasonable, almost official, but Emma could see the menace behind his smile. She'd encountered boys like Derek before, boys who learned early that charm could be just as effective as violence, that the right words delivered with the right tone could accomplish what fists alone could not. Ben's hands shook as he reached into his pocket, pulling out a crumpled $5 bill that was probably meant for his own lunch. Emma felt a familiar fire building in her chest, the same feeling she'd experienced when she watched injustice unfold and did nothing about it. She remembered her father's words from that morning, delivered over breakfast with the earnest intensity that characterized all their conversations since the move. "Emma, I know starting over is hard, but sometimes a fresh start is exactly what we need. Try to stay out of trouble, okay? Try to blend in." Blending in. That had been her strategy for 3 weeks now, and what had it gotten her? Loneliness, whispered speculation, and the growing certainty that running from problems didn't make them disappear. It just meant they followed you wherever you went. As she watched Derek pocket Ben's lunch money while Madison giggled and Troy cracked his knuckles menacingly, Emma felt something shift inside her chest. The careful walls she'd built around her emotions began to crack, and through those cracks seeped a familiar sensation, the cold, calculating fury that had once made her gymnastics routines legendary and her opponents terrified. She thought about Ben going hungry for the rest of the day, about Derek's satisfied smirk, about the pattern that would repeat tomorrow and the day after that, until someone finally said enough. Emma Martinez had spent 3 years trying to disappear, trying to become small and unremarkable and safe. But as she watched the casual cruelty unfold before her, she realized that safety built on silence wasn't safety at all. It was just another kind of prison. The mouse was about to roar. Emma's grip tightened around her plastic fork as she watched the scene unfold. Every instinct screamed at her to look away, to focus on her sandwich, to maintain the carefully constructed invisibility that had protected her for 3 weeks. But something deeper, something that had been dormant since Sacramento, stirred within her chest like a sleeping giant awakening. The sound of Derek's laughter as he pocketed Ben's money cut through the cafeteria noise like a blade, and Emma found herself rising from her seat before her conscious mind had made the decision. Her movement was fluid, almost predatory, as she approached the vending machines. Years of gymnastics training had given her an unusual gait, silent, balanced, and deceptively quick. Students at nearby tables barely noticed her passing, their attention focused on their own conversations and concerns. But Emma's focus had narrowed to a laser point, her peripheral vision cataloging every detail. The lunch monitor's position, by the serving line, the emergency exits, the distance between herself and Derek's group, the layout of tables that could provide cover or obstacles. Excuse me. Emma's voice cut through their conversation like ice water. Derek, Madison, and Troy turned toward her with expressions ranging from surprise to annoyance. Ben, pressed against the vending machine with his empty hands still trembling, looked at her with a mixture of hope and terror. I think you have something that doesn't belong to you. Derek's eyebrows rose in mock surprise, his politician's smile spreading across his face. Well, well, the mysterious new girl finally speaks. I was beginning to think you were mute. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. His tone was friendly enough that any passing adult would assume they were having a pleasant conversation, but Emma could hear the steel underneath. I'm Derek Kane, student body president. I don't think we've been properly introduced. We haven't, Emma replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline beginning to course through her veins. And we won't be. Just give Ben his money back and we can all go back to our lunches. Madison stepped forward, her perfectly styled hair catching the fluorescent light. Listen, new girl, you obviously don't understand how things work around here. Derek is collecting voluntary contributions for the spring dance. Ben was happy to participate, weren't you, Ben? She turned to the cowering boy with a smile that held all the warmth of a snake's kiss. Ben's mouth opened and closed wordlessly, his eyes darting between Emma and his tormentors. Emma could see the calculation in his expression, the desperate weighing of immediate safety against long-term consequences. She recognized that look because she'd worn it herself countless times, the expression of someone trapped between bad choices and worse ones. Voluntary, Emma repeated, tasting the word like something bitter. That's interesting because from where I was sitting it looked more like robbery. Troy stepped closer, using his height advantage to loom over Emma. You've got a smart mouth for someone so small. Maybe you need to learn some manners. His hand moved to his pocket, and Emma's trained eye caught the gesture. She'd seen that move before, the subtle threat of violence wrapped in casual body language. The lunch monitor, Mrs. Henderson, was still 30 feet away, engaged in breaking up a food fight at the freshman table. The nearest teacher, Mr. Collins, was focused on his own lunch and a stack of papers that needed grading. Emma realized with crystal clarity that she was on her own, just as she'd been 3 years ago when everything changed. The familiar weight of isolation settled on her shoulders, but this time, instead of crushing her, it felt like armor. Here's what's going to happen, Derek said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting. You're going to walk back to your little corner table, finish your sad little lunch, and pretend this conversation never happened. Ben here is going to thank us for giving him the opportunity to contribute to school spirit. And tomorrow, maybe, you'll remember that Lincoln Middle School has a certain way of doing things. Emma felt the moment crystallize around her, the way it had during competitions when time seemed to slow and every muscle in her body knew exactly what needed to happen next. She could see Derek's confidence, Madison's anticipation, Troy's barely contained violence. She could see Ben's desperate hope warring with learned helplessness, and she could see herself reflected in the vending machine's glass surface, looking smaller and younger than her 13 years, but carrying something in her eyes that hadn't been there since the accident. You're right about one thing, Emma said, her voice carrying a new quality that made Derek's smile falter slightly. Lincoln Middle School does have a certain way of doing things, but maybe it's time for that to change. The words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down in an ancient arena. Emma could feel the attention of nearby students beginning to shift toward their group, drawn by some invisible tension that promised drama. This was the moment her father had warned her about. The crossroads where good intentions met harsh realities. She thought about his worried face that morning, about the boxes still unpacked in their new apartment, about the promises she'd made to stay invisible and avoid trouble. But she also thought about Ben's trembling hands, about the $5 bill that probably represented his entire lunch budget for the week, about the satisfied smirk on Derek's face as he exercised power over someone who couldn't fight back. She thought about all the times she'd been Ben, standing helpless while stronger people took what they wanted simply because they could. Derek's mask of friendly authority began to slip, revealing something harder underneath. You know what? I think you need an attitude adjustment. Madison, why don't you help our new friend understand how things work around here? Madison moved with practiced precision, her hand shooting out to grab Emma's wrist. It was meant to be a dominance display, a way to establish physical control while maintaining plausible deniability if any adults noticed. But Madison had made a critical error in judgment. She'd assumed that Emma's small stature and quiet demeanor indicated weakness, that her silence stemmed from fear rather than careful observation. The moment Madison's fingers closed around her wrist, Emma's body responded with muscle memory that preceded conscious thought. 3 years of elite gymnastics training, thousands of hours spent perfecting balance and leverage, countless repetitions of movements designed to generate maximum power from minimal space, all of it crystallized into a single fluid motion. Emma's free hand came up in a sharp arc, breaking Madison's grip with a technique that looked accidental, but sent Madison stumbling backward with a cry of surprise. The movement was so smooth, so apparently effortless, that most observers would have assumed Madison had simply lost her balance. But Emma knew better, and from the shocked expression on Derek's face, so did he. "How did you—" Madison started, cradling her wrist and staring at Emma with new eyes. "Gymnastics," Emma said, simply, though the word carried volumes of unspoken history. 4 hours a day, 6 days a week, for 8 years. You learn things about leverage and physics that they don't teach in regular PE class. The cafeteria around them had grown quieter, conversations dying as students sensed drama unfolding. Emma could see phones being discreetly pulled from pockets, fingers hovering over camera apps. In a few seconds, whatever happened next would be preserved forever in digital form, shared and reshared until it became part of Lincoln Middle School legend. Derek's politician's mask slipped completely, revealing the calculating predator underneath. "You just made a very big mistake, new girl. Do you have any idea who you're messing with?" Emma looked at him steadily, feeling something settle into place inside her chest, something that had been broken and scattered for 3 years, finally reassembling into its proper form. "I'm messing with a bully who steals lunch money from kids who can't fight back, and my name is Emma Martinez. You might want to remember it." The silence in the cafeteria stretched like a rubber band about to snap. Emma could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on her, students craning their necks to get a better view of the confrontation unfolding near the vending machines. The air felt electric, charged with the kind of tension that preceded either violence or retreat. Derek's face had transformed from its usual mask of polished charm into something altogether more dangerous, his jaw clenched tight and his hands balling into fists at his sides. "Emma Martinez," he repeated slowly, as if testing how the name felt in his mouth. "Well, Emma Martinez, you've just declared war on the wrong person. I run this school. The teachers love me, the principal thinks I walk on water, and every student here knows better than to cross me. You're about to learn why." Troy stepped forward, his massive frame casting a shadow over Emma. At 14, he'd already reached nearly 6 feet in height and had the build of someone who'd spent years on football fields and wrestling mats. His reputation for settling disputes with his fists was well established, and Emma could see the anticipation in his eyes as he prepared to make an example of her. But something in Emma's posture gave him pause. She hadn't backed down or shown any of the usual signs of fear that typically preceded his victim's surrender. Instead, Emma stood perfectly balanced on the balls of her feet, her weight distributed evenly, her hands relaxed at her sides but ready to move. Her breathing was controlled, steady, and her eyes tracked every micro-movement of the three students. Surrounding her, it was the stance of someone who had spent thousands of hours training her body to respond to threats. Someone who understood that fights were won or lost in the first few seconds, before conscious thought could interfere with trained reflexes. "Last chance," Derek said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Walk away now, and maybe we'll let you eat lunch in peace for the rest of the year. Keep pushing, and I promise you'll regret it every single day until you graduate." Emma's response was to take a deliberate step closer to Ben, positioning herself between him and his tormentors. The gesture was small but unmistakable in its meaning. She wasn't just refusing to back down, she was actively choosing to protect someone who couldn't protect himself. The symbolic weight of the moment wasn't lost on the gathering crowd of students, many of whom had found themselves in Ben's position at some point during their time at Lincoln Middle School. "You know what I think?" Emma said, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet cafeteria. "I think you've been getting away with this for so long that you've forgotten what it feels like when someone says no. Well, here's your reminder, no. You don't get to take his money, you don't get to scare him, and you definitely don't get to threaten me." Madison, still nursing her wrist from Emma's defensive move, looked between Derek and Troy with growing excitement. Are we really going to let her talk to us like this, in front of everyone? Her voice carried an edge of hysteria, the sound of someone whose carefully constructed social hierarchy was being challenged by an outsider who didn't understand the rules. The crowd of students had grown larger, forming a loose circle around the confrontation. Emma could see phones being held up, recording everything, and she knew that whatever happened next would be preserved forever in digital form. Part of her mind, the part that sounded like her father's worried voice, screamed at her to find a way out, to de-escalate before things went too far. But a larger part, the part that had been quiet for 3 years, was finally awake and ready to act. Troy made the first move, lunging forward with his right hand extended toward Emma's shoulder. It was meant to be a simple grab, the kind of dominance display that had worked on countless other students. But Emma wasn't like other students. The moment she saw his weight shift forward, her body responded with the fluid precision of someone who had spent years defying gravity. She sidestepped Troy's grasp with a dancer's grace, her movement so economical and efficient that he stumbled past her, his momentum carrying him into the vending machine with a metallic crash that echoed through the cafeteria. The impact was hard enough to rattle the glass front and send Troy bouncing back, off balance and confused. Before he could recover, Emma had already reset her position, once again standing between Ben and his attackers. The crowd of students erupted in whispers and gasps. Troy Hansen, the terror of Lincoln Middle School, had just been made to look foolish by a girl half his size. Madison's mouth fell open in shock while Derek's face darkened with rage. The power dynamic that had seemed so fixed and permanent just moments before was suddenly dramatically in question. "How did she?" someone whispered from the crowd. "Did you see how fast she moved?" came another voice. Troy recovered his balance and turned back toward Emma, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "You little—" He swung wildly, a haymaker that would have connected with devastating force if Emma had been where he expected her to be. But she wasn't. Years of gymnastics training had taught her to read body language like a foreign language, to anticipate movement before it happened, to turn an opponent's strength against them. She ducked under Troy's swing, the motion so smooth it looked almost choreographed. As his fist passed harmlessly over her head, Emma planted her feet and drove her shoulder into his midsection with the force of a small battering ram. The impact, drove the air from Troy's lungs and sent him staggering backward, gasping for breath. Emma followed up with a precise push to his chest, using his own backward momentum to send him sprawling across one of the lunch tables, scattering trays and sending food flying. The cafeteria erupted in chaos. Students jumped up from their seats, some cheering, others backing away from the confrontation. Mrs. Henderson, the lunch monitor, finally noticed the commotion and began pushing through the crowd, shouting for order. But Emma's attention remained laser-focused on Derek and Madison, both of whom were staring at her with expressions of disbelief and growing fear. "This isn't possible," Madison breathed, her voice barely audible over the noise of the crowd. "She's just some quiet new girl. She's nobody." Emma stepped toward them, her movement causing both to instinctively back away. "I'm nobody," she agreed, her voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "Which means I have nothing to lose, but you have reputations to protect, images to maintain, so here's what's going to happen." She reached into Derek's pocket with lightning speed, retrieving Ben's crumpled $5 bill before he could react. The movement was so quick and unexpected that Derek didn't even think to resist until it was already over. Emma held the money up for everyone to see, then handed it back to Ben, whose hands were shaking so badly he could barely grasp it. "From now on, Ben eats his lunch in peace," Emma continued, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the cafeteria. "So does every other kid in this school. The days of you three taking whatever you want from whoever you want are over." Derek's face had gone pale, then flushed red with rage. "You have no idea what you've just started," he hissed. "I have. I'm friends, connections, resources you can't even imagine. I'll make your life here a living hell." Emma smiled, and there was something in that expression that made Derek take another step backward. "You can try," she said simply, "but I should probably mention something about myself that you might find interesting. See, 3 years ago, I wasn't just some quiet girl who minded her own business. 3 years ago, I was California Junior Gymnastics, champion in my age division. I trained with Olympic hopefuls, competed against the best athletes in the country, and won more medals than I could count." The crowd had gone silent again, hanging on every word. Emma could see the calculation in Derek's eyes as he processed this information, trying to reconcile the shy, invisible girl he'd categorized her as with the evidence of what she was capable of. "So when I tell you that your little reign of terror is over," Emma continued, "I'm not making an idle threat. I'm making a promise, and I always keep my promises." Mrs. Henderson finally broke through the crowd, her face flushed with exertion and authority. "What in heaven's name is going on here?" she demanded, looking at the overturned table, the scattered food, and Troy still groaning on the floor. Emma straightened up, her demeanor shifting instantly back to that of a respectful student. Just a misunderstanding, Mrs. Henderson. I think it's been resolved." But as the lunch monitor began sorting out the chaos, Emma caught Derek's eye. One more time, the message passed between them was clear and unmistakable. The old order at Lincoln Middle School had just been shattered, and something new was about to take its place. The aftermath of the cafeteria incident rippled through Lincoln Middle, school like stones thrown into still water. Within hours, grainy cell phone videos had circulated through every social media platform the students used, transforming Emma Martinez from an invisible newcomer into the most talked-about person in school. The footage showed her fluid movements, the way she dismantled Troy's attacks with what looked like effortless precision, and most memorably, the moment she'd reached into Derek's pocket to retrieve Ben's money with the casual confidence of someone taking back what was rightfully theirs. Emma walked through the hallways the next morning to a symphony of whispers and stares. Unlike the speculation that had followed her during her first weeks at Lincoln, these conversations carried a different energy entirely. Students stepped aside as she passed, not out of avoidance, but out of something approaching respect. Groups of younger kids watched her with undisguised admiration, while older students studied her with the calculating interest of people reassessing a situation. They thought they understood. "Is that really her?" she heard someone whisper as she stopped at her locker. "My cousin said she used to be some kind of champion gymnast," came the reply. "Did you see what she did to Troy? He's been bullying kids since elementary school, and she made him look like a complete amateur." Emma kept her expression neutral as she gathered her books, but internally she was processing the dramatic shift in her social environment. For 3 weeks, she'd worked to remain invisible, to blend into the background and avoid drawing attention to herself. Now, invisibility was no longer an option. Every move she made was being watched, analyzed, and discussed. The question was whether this newfound notoriety would make her life easier or infinitely more complicated. Her first class of the day was English with Mrs. Campbell, a stern woman in her 50s who maintained order through a combination of sharp wit and genuine care for her students' education. Emma had always appreciated Mrs. Campbell's no-nonsense approach to teaching, the way she focused on the material rather than the social dynamics that seemed to consume so much energy in other classes. But today, even Mrs. Campbell seemed affected by the changed atmosphere surrounding Emma. "Miss Martinez," Mrs. Campbell said as Emma took her usual seat in the back row, "I trust you'll find today's discussion of conflict resolution in literature particularly relevant." The comment drew a few snickers from other students, and Emma felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment. She nodded politely and opened her textbook, hoping to disappear into the familiar comfort of academic work. But throughout the class, she could feel eyes on her, students turning to glance at her whenever Mrs. Campbell discussed themes of justice, standing up to oppression, or characters who fought against unfair systems. When the bell rang, Emma gathered her things quickly, hoping to escape before anyone could approach her with questions or comments. But as she reached the door, Ben Thompson appeared beside her, his usual nervous energy replaced by something that looked almost like determination. "Emma," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying an urgency that made her pause. "I need to talk to you." She studied his face, noting the way his hands still shook slightly, but how his shoulders seemed straighter than they had the day before. "About what?" "About yesterday, about what you did." Ben glanced around nervously, then leaned closer. "My sister Sophie wants to meet you. She runs Chen's Corner Cafe on Maple Street, and she's been dealing with some problems lately. Problems that are a lot like what happened in the cafeteria." Emma felt a familiar knot form in her stomach. The last thing she wanted was to get pulled deeper into other people's conflicts, especially when she was still trying to figure out how to navigate her own changed circumstances. "Ben, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but please," Ben interrupted, his voice carrying a desperation that cut through her planned refusal. "Sophie's been protecting me my whole life. She dropped out of high school to work full-time when our parents died, and she sacrificed everything to make sure I could have a normal childhood. But lately, these guys have been coming to the restaurant, causing trouble, demanding money. She won't call the police because she's afraid it'll hurt the business, and she won't ask for help because she thinks she has to handle everything alone." Emma found herself thinking about the dynamics she'd observed the day before, the way power worked in small communities, how people like Derek operated in the spaces between official authority and daily life. What kind of guys? High school kids, mostly. They come in late at night, order food, then claim it was prepared wrong and demand their money back. Sometimes they bring friends and take up all the tables without ordering anything, driving away real customers. Last week, someone threw a brick through our front window. Ben's voice cracked slightly. "Sophie pretends it's no big deal, but I can see how scared she is." The bell for second period rang, and students began flowing through the hallways toward their next classes. Emma stood still in the midst of the crowd, feeling the weight of Ben's request and the implications of what he was asking. Getting involved would mean stepping even further away from the low profile she'd tried to maintain, possibly putting herself in conflict with people beyond the relatively contained world of middle school politics. But she also remembered the look on Ben's face the day before, the helpless terror of someone being victimized by people who were stronger and more ruthless. She thought about his sister, someone she'd never met, trying to protect both her business and her younger brother, while dealing with escalating threats from people who saw her vulnerability as an opportunity. "Where do you eat lunch?" Emma asked suddenly. Ben looked confused by the change of subject. "Usually the library. It's quieter there, and Mrs. Peterson lets me help her organize the returned books." "Not anymore. From now on, you eat with me in the cafeteria." "But Emma, I don't think that's—" "Ben." Emma's voice was firm, but not unkind. "If your sister is dealing with the same kind of people who were taking your lunch money, then the first step is making sure you're not an easy target. People, like Derek, test boundaries, and they start with whoever seems most vulnerable. If you're sitting alone in the library, hiding from everyone, you're advertising that you can be pushed around." Ben's eyes widened with understanding, and Emma could see him processing the strategic implications of what she was suggesting. "You want me to be more visible. I want you to be less afraid. There's a difference." Emma adjusted her backpack and started walking toward her next class. "Meet me at my table at lunch, and Ben, tell your sister I'll stop by the restaurant this afternoon." As they walked through the hallways together, Emma noticed the ripple effect their pairing created. Students who had been watching her with curiosity now looked at Ben with new interest, as if his association with her had elevated his status by proximity. She could see Derek and his crew near their lockers, their expressions darkening as they observed this development. Madison whispered something to Troy, who was sporting an impressive bruise on his forehead from his encounter with the lunch table. Emma's second period was advanced mathematics with Mr. Peterson, a young teacher who had started at Lincoln the same year Emma arrived. Unlike Mrs. Campbell, Mr. Peterson seemed uncomfortable with the changed dynamic in his classroom, unsure how to address the elephant in the room that was Emma's newfound reputation. He taught his lesson on algebraic equations with obvious tension, glancing at Emma periodically as if expecting her to disrupt the class somehow. During the lesson, Emma found her mind wandering to the larger patterns at play in the school's social ecosystem. Derek's power hadn't been built overnight. It was the result of careful cultivation, strategic alliances, and the tacit cooperation of adults who preferred to believe that popular, well-spoken students like him were natural leaders rather than sophisticated bullies. Taking him down would require more than a single confrontation in the cafeteria. It would require understanding how his network operated and finding ways to disrupt it systematically. When third period ended, Emma made her way to her locker, only to find Jake Williams waiting for her. Jake was something of an enigma at Lincoln Middle School, popular enough to run with Derek's crowd when it suited him, but independent enough to maintain friendships across different social groups. He was tall, athletic, and possessed the kind of easy confidence that made him well-liked by both students and teachers. But there was something in his expression now that suggested internal conflict. "Emma," he said as she approached, "I've been thinking about what happened yesterday." She opened her locker and began gathering books for her next class, not immediately responding to his statement. Jake had been present during several of Derek's previous confrontations with other students, never participating directly, but never intervening either. His presence now felt significant, though she wasn't sure yet what it meant. "I want you to know that not everyone in our group agrees with Derek's methods," Jake continued, his voice low enough that other students couldn't overhear. "Some of us have been getting uncomfortable with how far things have gone." Emma closed her locker and turned to face him fully. uncomfortable enough to do something about it, or just uncomfortable enough to feel guilty. The directness of her question seemed to catch Jake off guard. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that suggested nervousness despite his confident exterior. "I don't know yet, but I wanted you to know that if you're planning something, if you're thinking about taking Derek on more directly, you might have more support than you realize." Emma studied his face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation. Jake's reputation was generally positive. He was known for being fair in group projects, respectful to teachers, and kind to younger students. But he was also Derek's friend, which meant his loyalties were potentially divided in ways that could make him either a valuable ally or a dangerous liability. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Jake glanced around the hallway, then met her eyes directly. "Because I've been watching Derek change over the past year, becoming more aggressive, more willing to hurt people to get what he wants. And because yesterday, when I saw you stand up to him, I realized how long it's been since anyone challenged the way things are around here." The warning bell for fourth period rang, and students began moving toward their classes. Emma shouldered her backpack and prepared to leave, but Jake caught her arm gently. "Emma, be careful. Derek's not going to let yesterday slide. He's already talking about ways to get back at you, and some of his ideas are pretty extreme." Emma looked down at Jake's hand on her arm, then back up at his face. "Jake, I appreciate the warning, but you should know something about me. I don't back down from bullies, no matter how creative they think they are." As she walked away, Emma could feel the weight of the conversation settling around her like armor. The battle lines were becoming clearer, alliances were forming, and the simple act of returning Ben's lunch money was evolving into something much larger and more complex. The quiet new girl who had arrived at Lincoln Middle School 3 weeks ago was gone forever, replaced by someone who was about to discover just how much power one person could wield when they refused to be afraid. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Maple Street as Emma walked toward Chen's Corner Cafe, her mind still processing Jake's warning from earlier in the day. The small restaurant sat wedged between a laundromat and a used bookstore, its red and gold sign slightly faded, but still welcoming. Through the large front windows, Emma could see a woman in her early 20s moving efficiently between tables, clearing dishes and wiping down surfaces with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing this work for years. Emma pushed through the front door, a small bell announcing her arrival. The interior was warm and inviting, with mismatched chairs around sturdy wooden tables and the lingering aroma of garlic, ginger, and soy sauce. Hand-painted murals of Chinese landscapes decorated the walls, and a glass case near the register displayed an array of homemade pastries and desserts. Despite the cozy atmosphere, Emma noticed several details that spoke to recent troubles: a piece of plywood covering what had obviously been a broken window, security cameras that looked newly installed, and a baseball bat leaning conspicuously against the wall behind the counter. The woman behind the counter looked up as Emma approached, and the family resemblance to Ben was immediately apparent. Sophie Chen had the same intelligent eyes and delicate features as her younger brother. But where Ben carried himself with nervous energy, Sophie radiated a kind of determined strength. Her black hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore a simple apron over jeans and a t-shirt. When she smiled, Emma could see the exhaustion lurking behind her welcoming expression. "You must be Emma," Sophie said, extending her hand in greeting. "Ben told me about what you did yesterday. I can't thank you enough for standing up for him." Emma shook Sophie's hand, noting the calluses and small burns that marked someone who worked with hot equipment and long hours. "Ben's a good kid. He didn't deserve what was happening to him." Sophie's smile faltered slightly, and she glanced around the empty restaurant before gesturing toward a corner booth. "Would you like to sit down? I can make you something to eat while we talk." Emma followed Sophie to the booth, sliding into the worn vinyl seat across from the older girl. Sophie disappeared into the kitchen for a few minutes, returning with 2 steaming bowls of soup and a plate of pot stickers that filled the air with savory aromas. As Emma tasted the soup, she was struck by how different this felt from her usual after-school routine of going straight home to an empty apartment and waiting for her father to return from work. "Ben said you've been having some problems here," Emma said, setting down her spoon and meeting Sophie's eyes directly. Sophie's shoulders tensed, and she looked down at her hands folded on the table. "It's nothing I can't handle. Just some kids who think they can push around a small business owner because I'm young and on my own." "What exactly have they been doing?" Sophie hesitated, then seemed to make a decision to trust Emma with the truth. "It started about 2 months ago. A group of high school boys began coming in, usually late in the evening when I'm here alone. At first, they seemed like regular customers, but then they started causing problems. They'd order food, eat most of it, then claim there was something wrong and demand their money back. When I refused, they'd get loud and aggressive, scaring away other customers." Emma listened intently, recognizing the pattern of escalating intimidation that bullies used to establish control. "Have you tried calling the police?" "Once," Sophie admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But by the time they arrived, the boys had left, and the officer basically told me it was a civil matter unless they actually committed a crime. The next night, someone threw a brick through my front window with a note attached." "What did the note say?" Sophie's jaw tightened. "That if I wanted to keep my business and my brother safe, I should learn to mind my own business and stop calling for help." Emma felt a cold anger building in her chest. The same feeling she'd experienced watching Derek intimidate Ben in the cafeteria. The pattern was identical, just scaled up. Identify vulnerable targets, establish dominance through intimidation, then exploit that dominance for material gain. The only difference was that Sophie was dealing with older, more sophisticated predators who understood exactly how to operate in the spaces between legal protection and daily reality. "Do you know who's behind it?" Emma asked. Sophie nodded reluctantly. "The leader is a boy named Marcus Webb. He's a senior at Riverside High School, and according to some of my other customers, he's been running similar operations at businesses all over town. Pizza places, convenience stores, anywhere that's owned by someone young or immigrant or otherwise vulnerable." Emma's mind began working through the implications. This wasn't just random teenage mischief. It was organized extortion. A systematic campaign to extract money from small business owners who couldn't afford to fight back. The connection to Derek's activities at the middle school level suggested a pipeline of learned behavior, older students, teaching younger ones how to use intimidation as a tool for getting what they wanted. "Sophie, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. How much money are we talking about? What are they actually demanding?" Sophie looked uncomfortable, but after a moment she answered, "Marcus claims I owe him protection money. $200 a month, he says, to make sure nothing bad happens to the restaurant or to Ben. He calls it a neighborhood safety fee, like it's some kind of legitimate service." Emma nearly choked on her soup. $200 a month represented a significant portion of what a small restaurant like this could realistically earn, especially one run by someone barely out of high school with no business experience or family support. It was exactly the kind of calculated exploitation that made her blood boil. And if you don't pay... Last week, they made it clear what would happen. 3 of them came in during the dinner rush, ordered expensive meals, then started a fight with each other that cleared out all my other customers. One of them accidentally knocked over a display case, breaking about $50 worth of dishes. Marcus apologized very politely and said it was unfortunate that accidents like this tend to happen in unsafe neighborhoods. Emma pushed her bowl away, no longer interested in eating. The sophistication of the operation was impressive in its ruthlessness. Marcus and his crew had created a system that generated steady income while maintaining plausible deniability. They could always claim that broken dishes were accidents, that fights were just teenage high spirits getting out of hand, that their presence was coincidental rather than threatening. Sophie, has anyone else in the neighborhood been dealing with similar problems? Mr. Patel at the convenience store, 2 blocks over, mentioned something about teenagers causing trouble, but he was vague about details. Mrs. Rodriguez, who runs the flower shop, said she's been having issues with vandalism. I think people are afraid to talk about it openly. Emma nodded, understanding how isolation was a key component of the intimidation strategy. By keeping victims separated and afraid to communicate with each other, Marcus prevented them from recognizing the scope of his operation or organizing any kind of collective response. What if I told you that there might be a way to deal with this problem, not just for you, but for everyone in the neighborhood who's being targeted? Sophie's eyes lit up with hope, then quickly dimmed with skepticism. Emma, I appreciate what you did for Ben, but this is different. These aren't middle school bullies. They're high school seniors who've been doing this for months. They have cars, money, connections. They're basically running a criminal enterprise, which means they have a lot more to lose than Derek and his friends do, Emma pointed out. High school seniors are worried about college applications, scholarships, their permanent records. They can't afford to have criminal charges on their transcripts. Sophie stared at Emma with growing amazement. You're serious about this, aren't you? You're actually thinking about taking on Marcus Webb? Emma met Sophie's gaze steadily. I'm thinking about taking on the system that allows people like Marcus to operate, but I can't do it alone, and I can't do it if the people being victimized aren't willing to stand up for themselves. Sophie was quiet for several minutes, staring out the window at the afternoon traffic on Maple Street. Emma could see the internal struggle playing out across her features, the desire for help warring with years of learned self-reliance, hope battling against the fear of making things worse. Finally, Sophie spoke. What would you need from me? Documentation. Every time they come in, every threat they make, every demand for money. We need to establish a pattern that shows this isn't random teenage mischief, but systematic extortion. And we need to connect with other business owners who are dealing with the same thing. Sophie nodded slowly. I have security cameras now. I've been recording everything since the brick incident. Good. What about Ben? How much does he know about what's been happening? Not everything, but enough to be scared. He's been having nightmares and his grades are starting to slip because he's worried about me all the time. Sophie's voice cracked slightly. He's already lost so much. I can't let these people destroy what little stability we've managed to build. Emma reached across the table and squeezed Sophie's hand. They won't. I promise you that. As Emma prepared to leave Chen's Corner Cafe, she felt the familiar sensation of pieces clicking into place in her mind. The connection between Derek's middle school operation and Marcus's high school extortion ring wasn't coincidental. It was part of a larger ecosystem of intimidation and exploitation that fed on vulnerable people and communities. Taking down Derek would be satisfying, but it wouldn't address the root problem. What was needed was something more comprehensive, something that would disrupt the entire network. Walking home in the fading daylight, Emma pulled out her phone and began researching Marcus Webb. Social media made it easy to find information about people, and within minutes she had a clear picture of his life. Star athlete on the football team, honor roll student, active in student government, college-bound with several scholarship offers. He was exactly the kind of person who had everything to lose and therefore might be more vulnerable to pressure than he appeared. But Emma also understood that taking on someone like Marcus would require more than the quick reflexes and gymnastics. Training that had worked against middle school bullies. It would require strategy, allies, and a plan that could dismantle his operation without giving him the opportunity to retaliate against Sophie, Ben, or the other victims. As she reached her apartment building, Emma's phone buzzed with a text. Message from an unknown number. Heard you've been asking questions about things that don't concern you. Might want to be more careful about who you trust. Some bridges burn easier than others. Emma stared at the message, recognizing it as both a threat and an indication that her activities had already attracted attention from people who preferred to operate in shadows. Instead of fear, she felt a familiar surge of determination. The quiet new girl who had arrived at Lincoln Middle School was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that sometimes the only way to stop a cycle of intimidation was to break it completely. She deleted the threatening message and began composing a text to Jake Williams. It was time to find out exactly how serious he had been about wanting to see changes at their school, and whether his discomfort with Derek's methods extended to taking real action against the broader network of exploitation that was poisoning their community. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.